She lived in a tree. No one knew why. No one asked. For 10 days, she didn't speak a single word. And the only person who noticed was a man who hadn't spoken much himself in years. He didn't ask her to come down. He just left food, quietly, at the base of the tree. And then, one morning, something changed. What happened between them will restore your faith in quiet kindness. So stay with us until the end, because this story holds something powerful. Not just about healing, but about finding home in the most unexpected place. If you're new here, subscribe now and leave a like if stories like this move you. Let's begin. The ranch land was quiet, the kind of silence only the desert knows, warm winds brushing through dry mesquite trees and the distant creak of old wooden fences swaying with time. But that silence had been interrupted for 3 days now by an unusual sight. A girl, no older than 12, perched high in the branches of a tall cottonwood tree near the border of the property. She hadn't come down. Not to eat, not to drink, not even when the sun scorched the earth below or when the wind howled at night. Locals had started whispering, unsure of who she was or where she'd come from. Her long black hair tangled in the wind, her legs tucked into her chest, she watched everything but spoke to no one. The rancher saw her on the second day. He was a quiet man, hardened by years of tending the land alone. The creases in his face weren't just from age, they were maps of a lifetime of solitude. He'd lost his wife decades ago, never had children, and preferred the company of cattle and crows to that of people. But something about the girl unsettled him. Not in a threatening way, more like a memory he couldn't quite place. That evening, instead of ignoring her like the others had, he left a small offering at the base of the tree, a cloth bundle with a sandwich, a tin cup of water, and half a red apple. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. He just placed it on the ground and walked away. The next morning, the bundle was gone. He did the same the following evening. This time, he left a boiled egg and a piece of cornbread wrapped in wax paper. Again, it vanished overnight. Still, she stayed in the tree. Neighbors began to scoff. "She's just being difficult," one said. "She probably ran away from home," another guessed. But none of them bothered to ask her. None of them left food. None of them looked up long enough to notice the fear in her eyes. The rancher, however, began to arrive a little earlier each day. He didn't say a word, didn't even wait to see if she noticed him. But he always left something, a slice of peach, a wool blanket, a tiny carved horse he once made in his youth. She still hadn't spoken. She hadn't come down. But for the first time since she climbed that tree, she cried, soft, silent tears that no one saw, except the moon. And when the wind carried the scent of grilled beans and mesquite through the air that night, something inside her softened, just a little. The fourth day began with a dry wind curling through the canyon. The sun was only beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the cracked earth and brush, but the rancher was already out, walking his usual path with slow, deliberate steps. His boots crunched against the gravel as he approached the cottonwood tree. She was still there. Perched in the same high crook of the branches, arms wrapped around her knees, hair like a dark veil covering half her face. She didn't move when he approached. But he noticed something had changed. One of the wool blankets he left now covered her shoulders. Without a word, he set down another bundle. This time it was beans wrapped in tortillas, still warm from the early fire, and a small orange, peeled and separated carefully. Next to it, he placed a folded note. He wasn't sure she could read, but it said only, "You don't have to speak. Just stay safe." He didn't wait. He never did. As he walked away, the wind picked up, rustling the low brush and pushing dust across the trail. He paused once, halfway to the barn, and looked back, not at the tree, but at the open sky. It had been years since he felt responsible for anyone. But something about that girl in the tree pulled at a place in his chest he thought had long gone numb. Back at the house, he worked in silence. Cleaned the tools. Fed the animals. Hauled water. His hands were steady, but his mind wandered. Who was she? Why had she chosen that tree, his tree, Of all places in this wide desert. And why wouldn't she come down? As evening fell and the sun dipped below the mesa, painting the sky in streaks of orange and blood red, he returned again. The plate was empty. The note was gone. Still no words from her. Still no movement beyond the occasional glance. But something shifted. She had climbed down just enough to sit on the lowest branch now, barely a few feet from the ground. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign that maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But their silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like respect. The desert cooled fast after sunset, and he left behind a second blanket and a metal cup filled with warm milk. Before leaving, he placed an old cowboy hat on the base of the tree, then walked away without looking back. That night, under a sky crowded with stars, she wore the hat like a shield and curled into the blanket. For the first time since climbing that tree, she slept with her eyes closed. The fifth morning arrived quietly, with the sky painted in shades of dusty pink and pale blue. A few crows cawed in the distance, circling over the barren fields before vanishing into the horizon. The rancher walked slowly, the same path he'd taken every day since she'd appeared, a thermos of hot tea in one hand and a worn-out paper bag in the other. As he neared the cottonwood, he stopped short. She was already looking at him. Not hiding. Not retreating. Just watching. Their eyes met for the first time, briefly, silently, but something passed between them. An understanding, perhaps. A fragile thread of recognition. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply knelt and placed the paper bag down like always. Inside was a small sandwich, a handful of blueberries, and a short pencil with a folded sheet of paper. He wasn't sure if she'd use it, but it felt like the right thing to leave. When he stood up, her voice, raspy and almost too soft for the wind to carry, floated down. "Thank you." The word landed heavier than he expected. He paused, taken aback, not because she spoke, but because it felt so full. Full of fear, of exhaustion, of pride, and of something else he couldn't name. He nodded once, then tipped his hat and walked away, his boots moving slower than usual. The rest of his day blurred by. While mending the fence and checking on the cattle, he kept hearing her voice, those two simple words, as if they were echoing in the empty spaces of the ranch. That evening, he returned not just with food, but with a small book, The Red Pony by Steinbeck, one of the few things left from his wife's old shelf. He left it at the base of the tree, along with a new note. "Stories helped me once. Maybe they'll help you too." When he looked up, she wasn't in the tree. For a split second, panic hit him. But then he heard the softest sound behind the trunk, a shuffle of feet, and there she was, peeking out from behind the bark, her face dirt-smudged, eyes wary but clearer than before. They didn't speak. He simply tipped his hat again and stepped back, giving her space. She approached the food slowly, took the book in both hands as if it were something sacred, and sat cross-legged at the base of the tree. Not up high. Not hiding. For the first time, she stayed on the ground. As the stars blinked into the sky, she opened the first page and began to read silently, her lips moving without sound. And the rancher, from a distance, watched as a tiny ember of peace returned to a heart that had clearly been wandering too long. The days began to fold gently into one another. The girl no longer climbed the tree. Instead, she sat beneath it every morning, legs crossed on the dry grass, back resting against the wide trunk. She never wandered far, just enough to feel the earth beneath her feet again. The rancher kept his rhythm. He never asked questions. He never pushed. But he kept coming, always with something in hand, a jar of honey from a neighbor, a slice of peach pie, a bar of soap wrapped in cloth. These small offerings weren't charity, they were gestures. Quiet reminders that she wasn't invisible. Sometimes she accepted them in silence. Other times, she offered a soft thanks or a single nod. But more often now, she looked up at him, not afraid, not suspicious. Just present. It was on the 9th day that she asked her first question. "What's your name?" The rancher was stacking hay when she spoke. He turned slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. "Name's Walt," he replied, voice steady, eyes calm. "And yours?" She hesitated. Looked at her hands, then the tree, then back at him. "Tallulah," she said finally. It hung in the air like a secret released. "Tallulah," he repeated gently. "That's a strong name." She didn't smile, not quite. But something eased in her shoulders. That evening, she helped carry a bucket of water from the well to the garden. She didn't speak much, but she followed him around the corral, watching how he fed the animals and mended the fences. He showed her how to tie a rope knot, and when she got it right, she let out a small, surprised laugh. It was the first sound of joy he'd heard from her. Over time, their routine became almost wordless. Walt began carving small wooden animals again, something he hadn't done since his wife passed. He left a rabbit by her spot one day. The next morning, it was tucked in her lap. One afternoon, she brought something of her own, a tiny woven bracelet, made of thread and dry grass. She left it on a fence post near his tools. When he found it, he held it for a long time before sliding it into the pocket over his heart. They never spoke of the tree again. Or why she'd climbed it. Some wounds didn't need naming to start healing. At night, she now slept in a small shelter Walt built beside the barn. It wasn't much, just a cot, a shelf, and a window, but it was hers. A place where she could close her eyes without fear. And for Walt, the silence on the ranch didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long golden shadows over the dry landscape. Birds fluttered low to the ground, and the cicadas had not yet begun their daily hum. Walt was already out in the corral, mending the gate latch, when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Tallulah stood there, barefoot, a strand of hair across her cheek, holding 2 cups of water, one for her, one for him. "Morning," she said, shy but clear. He took the cup with a quiet nod. "Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, sipping, listening to the wind roll over the empty fields. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, still, but full. She glanced toward the horizon. "It's quieter here," she murmured. "Even the quiet back where I lived, it was different. It was like people wanted me to disappear." Walt didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She continued. "There was a night. I heard yelling. Then I heard things break. And someone crying. I didn't know what to do, so I ran." Her voice cracked slightly. "I thought the tree would keep me safe." Walt lowered his cup slowly. His face didn't show shock or pity, only a deep, steady calm. "You did what you needed to do," he said. "Sometimes, the safest place is the one we make for ourselves." She sat down in the dirt, pulling her knees to her chest. "I didn't think anyone would find me. I didn't want them to." Walt took a seat nearby, not too close. "I didn't try to find you," he said simply. "I just saw someone hungry. And scared." Tallulah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Do you ever feel like the world forgot about you?" He chuckled softly, the sound rough and low. "Every day. Until about 10 days ago." She smiled then. A small, flickering thing. But it was real. That afternoon, she helped him in the barn. He showed her how to brush the horse gently, how to oil the hinges of the stable doors. She asked questions, not many, but enough to show she was interested. And later, as the light faded and the desert turned cold again, she walked up to the porch steps and sat beside him. She watched him whittle a piece of cedar, shaping it slowly into a feather. "My mom used to braid my hair before school," she said suddenly. She sang songs in our language. She stopped after a while. "I don't know why." Walt paused his carving. "You remember the songs?" She nodded. "Then maybe you can sing them again someday." Tallulah didn't answer. But she looked up at the stars, and for a long time, didn't look away. The winds had shifted. The summer air no longer carried the dry bite of early June. It was warmer now, rounder, thick with the scent of earth and something softer. Change, maybe. Healing, perhaps. Tallulah had begun to move differently. She walked with more purpose, no longer glancing over her shoulder at every sound. Her feet found the beaten paths between the corral, the barn, and the big oak table behind the house where Walt often sat whittling or eating in the shade. That morning, she brought her own offering to the table, a folded napkin with 2 wild mesquite pods and a small stone painted in blue lines. "I used to make these for my grandmother," she explained. She said they brought calm. Walt studied the stone in his weathered hand. "I think it's working already." They both chuckled. Later, as they repaired the fence around the west pasture, Tallulah stopped mid-hammer and stared at the hills beyond the property. Walt noticed the shift in her eyes, distant, thoughtful. "My dad used to stand like that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "At the edge of the village. Like he was waiting for someone. Maybe himself." Walt leaned on the fence post. "You miss him?" Tallulah shrugged. "I don't know if I miss the real him, or the him I imagined. He changed. Got smaller somehow. Like the world crushed something inside him and he just let it." They stood in silence. "People carry pain in strange ways," Walt finally said. "Some carry it in fists. Others in silence." Tallulah looked down. "I think I ran because I didn't want to turn into them." Walt nodded slowly. "That takes wisdom. Not everyone knows when to leave." They kept working, the quiet filled only by the rhythmic sound of nails meeting wood. At lunch, Tallulah asked if she could cook something. Walt smiled and said, "As long as you don't burn the cornbread." In the small kitchen, she moved with both hesitation and grace, remembering movements from a childhood now layered with dust. Walt sat nearby, watching but not intruding. When she served the meal, beans, warm tortillas, and a touch of honey on the side, he took a bite and let out a satisfied sigh. "You've got talent," he said. "Ever think about doing more with it?" Tallulah tilted her head. "Like what?" "Like building something," he said. "Something you can call yours." She didn't answer right away. But that evening, back beneath the cottonwood tree, she opened the little red notebook he'd given her weeks earlier, the one she hadn't touched until now, and began to write. She didn't know what it would become. But for the first time, she believed there might actually be a later worth preparing for. The morning sun crept over the hills with a softness that matched the mood on the ranch. Walt was already up, sipping coffee on the porch, when he heard the creak of the barn door. Tallulah stepped out, hair tied loosely, cheeks flushed with sleep, holding a worn broom twice her height. "I thought I'd sweep the stalls," she said. He smiled behind his mug. "You're starting to sound like someone who lives here." She gave a half-smile. "Maybe I am." Over the next few days, something shifted in the way they moved. They were no longer two strangers sharing space, they were a rhythm. Tallulah swept and watered. Walt hauled feed and fixed the hinges on the barn doors. Together they cleaned out the old chicken coop and planted squash near the fence line. But what caught Walt off guard was what she did next. One afternoon, while he was out fixing a busted pipe near the windmill, Tallulah stayed behind. She gathered scrap wood, some leftover nails, and a few pieces of tin roofing. Carefully, with quiet determination, she began building. By sundown, when Walt returned, he saw it, a small lean-to structure beside the barn, barely tall enough to stand in, but sturdy, with a slanted roof and space for a cot. Tallulah was sitting inside, legs stretched out, brushing dust off her shirt. She looked up at him, uncertain. "I didn't want to stay in the tree anymore," she said. "But I still needed something, mine." Walt stood there for a moment, then walked over and ducked inside the shelter. He ran his hand along the beam, then looked at her. "It's solid," he said. "And smart. You used cross-bracing on the corners." She lit up a little, proud without needing praise. "I watched how you built the shed." They spent the evening sitting beside the fire pit, roasting pieces of bread over glowing coals. Tallulah hummed softly, one of the old songs she remembered from her mother's voice. Walt didn't interrupt. The next morning, he left a small surprise in her lean-to, a clean pillow and a wool blanket, carefully folded. No note. Just quiet affirmation. The shelter became her home. She decorated it with feathers, stones, and small drawings she sketched at night. Each item held meaning. Each corner, memory. And Walt, who once thought his days of building anything new were over, found himself looking at the ranch differently. It wasn't just a place of routine anymore. It was growing. Evolving. With her. Tallulah started writing more in her notebook, small dreams, pieces of stories, even plans for fixing up the broken wagon out back. She didn't know yet what her future looked like, but for the first time, she believed she'd be the one to shape it. By now, the ranch had taken on a new rhythm. Not rushed, not loud, just full. Morning chores were met with quiet teamwork. Tallulah rose early, sometimes before Walt, already halfway through feeding the chickens by the time he wandered outside rubbing his eyes and sipping coffee. She had started naming the animals. The shy goat became Nina. The gray barn cat was Bones. Even the old mule, who barely moved unless nudged with a carrot, had a name now, Justice. Walt didn't say much about it, but every time she spoke one of their names, he felt something gentle stir in his chest. The neighbors noticed too. First it was Mrs. Delaney, the widow down the road. She stopped by with fresh eggs and raised an eyebrow at the sight of Tallulah working in the garden. "She yours?" she asked Walt, half teasing. He shook his head slowly. "She's here. That's what matters." Then came Mr. Sanchez, who offered 2 hens in exchange for help mending his fence. Walt declined the hens but sent Tallulah anyway. She returned with dusty boots and a grin he hadn't seen before. "I like fixing things," she said that evening. "It makes me feel like I belong somewhere." Walt nodded. "You do." It was a simple exchange, but it anchored her. They started sitting on the porch together after supper. She would read aloud from books they found in the attic, and Walt would listen with his eyes half closed, the words washing over him like warm wind. Sometimes she shared parts of her own writing, tentative, unsure, but he always listened carefully, never interrupting. One evening, as the sky burned orange and purple, she asked, "Do you ever wish you had a family?" Walt didn't answer right away. He looked out at the land, at the fences he'd mended alone for years, and said, "I did. For a long time. Then I stopped wishing." She was quiet for a moment. "And now?" He looked at her. "Now I just feel lucky." She didn't respond, but her eyes shimmered in the fading light. That weekend, they rode into town together. It was Tallulah's first time in months. She wore boots a size too big and a faded blue shirt that Walt had stitched at the seams. People stared, but Walt stood beside her, steady as ever. They bought seeds for the garden, a bag of sugar, and 2 small notebooks, one for her, one for him, though he never wrote in his. On the way home, she sat beside him in the truck, humming under her breath, the desert racing by in waves of gold. Back at the ranch, they planted marigolds by the fence. Tallulah said they reminded her of her grandmother. And that night, as the flowers leaned into the wind and the stars blinked awake, the ranch no longer felt like a place of silence and solitude. It felt like home. The days grew longer. The air carried the thick scent of sage and dust, and the ranch thrived in its quiet way. Tallulah had become part of its heartbeat, her footsteps in the garden, her laughter echoing from the barn, her hums rising with the smoke from morning fires. Walt watched it all with a kind of reverence. He never said it, but he felt it in his bones. The land was healing, because she was healing. One morning, as they stacked bales of hay onto the truck, Walt said casually, "We'll head into town again tomorrow. Need a few things from the feed store." Tallulah paused. "Can we stop by the community center?" He looked at her. "Of course. Something on your mind?" She hesitated. "There's a woman there. Someone said she helps kids like me figure out where they're allowed to be." Walt nodded, not asking more. The next day, they made the dusty trip into town. The roads were bumpy, the old radio barely worked, but Tallulah looked out the window the whole time, wide-eyed and alert, soaking in every small detail: the bent street signs, the smell of grilled corn from a vendor, the kids racing bikes near the church. At the community center, she stepped inside alone. Walt waited outside, hands in his pockets, leaning on the hood of the truck. The sun was high, and sweat rolled down his neck, but he didn't move. Inside, Tallulah met a woman named Miss Rivera, soft-spoken, kind eyes, and a clipboard that never felt cold. They talked for nearly an hour. About rights. About safety. About options. When she came back out, she was holding a small manila envelope. "What's that?" Walt asked. She opened it and showed him a printed form. "She said I can apply for a special guardianship, so you don't get in trouble for letting me stay." Walt raised an eyebrow. "You want to stay?" Tallulah didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. Back at the ranch, they sat at the kitchen table and filled out the forms together. It was awkward. Walt hadn't held a pen for longer than a few minutes in years, but they managed. He read every line carefully, making sure Tallulah understood each part. Over the next week, Miss Rivera visited the ranch twice. She asked questions. Looked around. Took notes. Tallulah gave a tour with quiet pride, pointing out the shed she built, the marigolds by the fence, the shelf of books she'd finished. And then one evening, the letter came. Walt opened it slowly, with Tallulah standing just behind him. "She said yes," he whispered. "It's approved." Tallulah let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Walt turned and placed a hand on her shoulder, not heavy, not firm. "Just there. You've got a place here," he said. "Not just for now. For as long as you need." That night, under a sky as wide as any dream, she danced barefoot near the fire, twirling with the barn cat chasing her shadow. And Walt, watching from the porch, laughed harder than he had in 20 years. Because something rare had happened. They hadn't just found each other. They'd found a future. The air was crisp the morning they began building the new fence on the east side of the property. Tallulah held one end of the post steady as Walt hammered. She was taller now, not much, but enough for him to notice. Her movements were stronger, more certain. She wore her hair in 2 long braids and tied a turquoise ribbon around her wrist every day. "I think we could plant more," she said as they worked. "Tomatoes, maybe corn. Enough to share." Walt nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's your land, too. You decide." Those words sat with her. Your land too. She let them echo quietly inside her chest. Over the following weeks, the ranch transformed again. Not in big, dramatic ways, but in slow, steady rhythms that only people who've lived through silence notice. Tallulah painted the shed a soft yellow. She organized the pantry, made labels for the jars, and started drawing colorful signs in English and Apache to place around the property: garden, barn, hope. One afternoon, she sat Walt down at the big kitchen table with a pencil and her old notebook. "I have an idea," she said. "There are other kids like me. Scared. Lost. Kids who don't want to talk but still want to be seen." Walt raised an eyebrow, already sensing where she was headed. "What if we build something here? A place where they can stay for a while. Learn how to plant things. Fix fences. Breathe." Walt didn't speak right away. He looked at her, not as a girl, not even as someone he'd helped, but as someone he now followed. "Then let's build it." Together, they cleared a small patch near the barn. They built a second lean-to, then a third. Neighbors donated supplies. Miss Rivera connected them with a counselor. Word began to spread, slowly but surely. By fall, 2 more girls had come to stay. Quiet, like Tallulah once was. Unsure. But they saw her, how she moved with purpose, how she treated the land, and they followed. And Walt? He smiled more. He taught the girls how to ride horses, how to fix a saddle, How to listen to the wind to tell if a storm was coming. One evening, Tallulah stood on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Walt joined her, 2 steaming cups of tea in hand. "This feels good," she said. "It is good," he replied. Then, after a pause, she added, "I'm thinking of writing it all down. Not just for me. For anyone who needs to know it's possible to start over." Walt nodded. "Start with the tree." She smiled, eyes soft. "I already did." And as the stars lit up the desert sky and the girls' laughter echoed from the barn, Tallulah finally understood something deep and quiet. She wasn't just safe. She was whole. She wasn't just surviving. She was home.